It's really exciting to advocate for something you truly believe in, which is why I'm so thrilled that Bandwidth Conversations is being sponsored by Clearer this year. Clearer has genuinely revitalized my skin. This isn't another cream on the shelf. Clearer is bespoke, evidence-based skincare created by consultant dermatologist Dr. Emma Craythorne, one of the leaders in her field. Emma's founding product, the Clearer Special, is a personalized night treatment that brings together multiple advanced actives, many of which you can't get over the counter, into one luxurious cream. And here's the thing. I've tried countless products over the years, all promising miracles. None worked. Then I started using Clearer, and within a month, friends were saying, "What have you done? Your skin looks amazing." And even I was doing double takes in the mirror. I looked fresher, younger, and glowing. And it's not just me saying this. Vogue, Elle, and Cosmopolitan all rave about Clearer. So if you want to find out more, head to clearer.skin. That's Klira.skin. If you want to find out more about Clearer founder, Dr. Emma Craythorne, listen to my podcast with her, as her story is fascinating and her credentials are mind-blowingly impressive. Plus, Bandwidth Conversations listeners get 20% off the Clearer Special for the first 3 months on quarterly and annual plans. Just use the code bandwidth20. It is a game changer. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, where we find out about the stories and journeys of creatives and rock stars of life. This podcast is part of the New College Oxford series of podcasts. Today's guest is someone who has spent his career exploring the extraordinary in the everyday and the human spirit in the face of the unimaginable. He is a celebrated author, journalist, producer, director, and documentarian whose work spans everything from the world's greatest disasters to the secrets of those who live beyond 100. He's written highly acclaimed books, including Disaster, A History of Earthquakes, Floods, Plagues, and Other Catastrophes, also Assassin's Deeds and Secrets of the Centenarians, and he's appeared on television and radio to share his deep knowledge and storytelling flair. I am really looking forward to hearing about everything from how to survive the storm to how to live a long and meaningful life. It's wonderful to be talking today to John Withington. Thanks so much, John, for being here.
Pleasure. Good to be here.
You grew up in Manchester. How do you reflect on your early years?
My mum and dad were terrific parents, I think, when I look back on it. We lived in a very ordinary house in an area called Gorton. I went to the local primary school, Abbey Hay Primary School. It was big classes. I can't speak for what they did for everybody, but for me, they did a fantastic job. I lived walking distance from school, so I was able to walk to and from school. I remember almost until I left, I used to come home for lunch from school. After I'd had my lunch, my mother would read to me for about 20 minutes. That was a great pleasure, actually.
At what stage did the teachers, do you think, realise that you probably were going to be quite good at your studies?
Relatively early, I think. The structure of the school was that there were 2 what they called infants classes. And then you went up to standard 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I remember in standard 1, I did very well in the exam, the end of term exam. They sent a very flattering school report to my mum and dad. And so I think that was the time when I realised I was doing quite well at school. And then in the last year, I think there were 3 or 4 of us they thought were potential for Manchester Grammar or William Hume's Grammar, which was the other direct grant school. And we were given special tuition, which actually is extraordinary, isn't it? Would this happen now? We were sent off to a room on our own to do unsupervised.
Wow. And it worked.
And
you didn't mess around.
It seemed to work, yeah. Well, I don't know whether it was conscious. As I say, it was a fairly ordinary working class area in Manchester. So whether we all realised this could be our ticket to a more comfortable life, because we all could see that our parents worked pretty hard and didn't have enormous rewards.
And what was Manchester Grammar like?
Big. 1,400 boys. I did reasonably well at school. I remember I went into History 6. I'd had this quite inspiring history teacher, a man called Seaton. We used to call him Cuthbert, but I don't think he was really called Cuthbert. His middle name was McGregor, but you wouldn't have known he was Scots to listen to him. The 4th form, so the last form before the 6th form, he taught us modern European history. So I think starting from the Battle of Waterloo and the Peace of Vienna, right through to wherever we could get to. And I just thought, well, this is a great story. And it was the subject that I enjoyed most. And lots of people said, what are you going in History 6 for? What can you do with history? Which is a good question.
Well, but actually you've answered it really well.
Well, yes, in a sense. So it took me a long time to start writing history books. So I went into History 6 and found that interesting and fun.
When did it become clear that going to Oxford was the next step?
Well, it was a bit like a military operation. So in the sixth form, there were 3 divisions. You start in Division 3, up to Division 2, up to Division 1, a bit like football before the Premier League. I think it was in the second division they decided what university you should apply to. And I think in History 6 2A, which I would have been in, I think pretty well, certainly 90% of the boys were put in for Oxbridge. And I was just told, oh, you're applying to Merton. And then there was stop press 2 days before the application goes, no, you're applying to New College. So, okay, fine, New College it is. And then I was doing all right at school, not doing brilliantly. And I remember I was at home one Wednesday night, just about to leave to see Manchester United versus Birmingham City at Old Trafford. So I'd left home, and we lived in what we used to call a frying pan in those days. So there's a straight road, wide enough for one car, and then there's a circle at the bottom, and the houses are all grouped around
Right.
it.
Okay.
So it's a cul-de-sac. As I left the house, this little moped went into the cul-de-sac. You didn't see that very much. So I thought, I wonder what that's all about. Anyway, my dad comes running up the street after me and said, you've had a telegram. You've had a telegram.
This is after you've interviewed.
This is after the interview. I opened the telegram and it says, elected to Open Sacker Scholarship, New College.
Oh my goodness, you received a scholarship to go.
So, which was a surprise. And so I said, well, that's great news, Dad. I'll see you after the match. I think he thought I might.
I want to stay home and celebrate. Get your priorities right.
The next day, reports were being handed out at school because it was very close to Christmas break. And we had a very nice teacher who was handing out the reports, and the report had not been particularly complimentary. The report was something about, he seems to be marking time, not making a lot of progress. And so then he had to write.
Cross it all out.
He just wrote, oh, well done, congratulations at the bottom. So that was a bit of a surprise. My only academic claim to fame, actually, is that when I took the Oxford entrance exam, I was only 16.
Oh my goodness, that was really young. A typical day in the life of John Withington at New College, what would that be?
I went to quite a few lectures when I first went. I hardly went to any in my second and third years. I went to very few lectures because I felt actually, unless you're a terrific shorthand writer, you can't really keep up with what's being said. The interesting thing about the lectures was that the spoken word isn't a great medium for conveying a lot of information.
Yes, that's
true. The textbook is much more efficient.
Yes, that's right.
And I thought that too many of the lecturers tried to convey a lot of information. And actually what they should have been doing is trying to give you new ways of looking at things. So that's my excuse. So I didn't go to a lot of lectures. And then there might be 3 tutorials a fortnight. I would go to the library. I'd actually work quite hard, but I think I didn't understand how to work particularly well. My feeling was that people who'd been to public school had a much better idea of how they organised their work. I tended to pick up a book and start at the beginning rather than homing in on this is the bit that matters.
Yes.
So I would go to the library. Then very often in the afternoon there would be lacrosse practice and then usually dinner in hall. That sounds a very boring day, doesn't it?
No, it sounds like a lovely day, actually. Were you enticed by any of the jobs that were on offer? The children of today, they have to fight so hard to get a job, whereas for us, they were on offer.
Not really, because as you rightly say, there was full employment pretty well in those days. What happened was the beginning of my third year, I think it'd be fair to say I'd not covered myself in glory, academically. And I remember going to see Penry Williams saying, oh, Penry, I thought for my next degree I would do X. And Penry very politely but firmly said, don't know. He didn't quite say, I don't think you're cut out for the academic life. And then I suddenly thought in a flash of lightning, I want to be a sports writer. I want to be a football writer. That's what I've always wanted to do. In those days, you could just write to people. I'm leaving you. Absolutely. And I remember getting taken out to, the nearest thing I got to being wined and dined was I was taken out to Fleet Street by the deputy sports editor of The Observer. And he invited me down for the day. And he spent a little bit of time looking at the office and talking about what they did. And then most of the afternoon, him showing me what he thought were the best pubs in Fleet Street. But sadly, nothing came of that. I just kept writing and writing. And eventually, I got hired by the BBC, by BBC North Region, to do a football report.
Okay, well, that's everything you wanted.
In a way, yeah. This would be August 1968, me having left New College in June 1968. And then they gave me another report to do on Bury versus somebody. Bury no longer with us, sadly. And then I applied for and got a job at the South Wales Guardian in Ammanford. But when I got to Ammanford, I thought, I think in those days it was 12,000 people. So it's a market town, but I'd been brought up in Manchester. You lived a bit of time in Oxford. Anyway, they offered me the job and I was going to be paid £12 something a week because I was still only 20.
That's so interesting. We're given today, I'm reading in the paper what the minimum wage has been changed to.
Yes.
So,
you get that much an hour now.
Yes,
not
you do.
A week. Yes.
You do. And that's low.
Yes. But of course, the cost of living was somewhat different.
It was.
I spoke to somebody that I'd met from doing these football reports. There's a man called Bob Williams, who was the sports editor of the Daily Telegraph, because he did sports reports for the BBC as well. And I said, I'm going to this job in Ammanford, but I'm not keen. He said, why don't you write to the Telegraph? They're always looking for people. And so I got in touch with the Telegraph. And 2 days before I was due to go to Ammanford, they said, do you want to come and work for us, be a sub-editor? I worked as a sub-editor on the Daily Telegraph, which is not the most exciting life. If you want any kind of social life, it's not great because you go into work about 4 in the afternoon and come home about midnight. Then I got, about the only time in my life I was headhunted, the BBC North region, would have been 21, 22. I got to make a radio documentary about Bury Football Club. And then I did another radio documentary while I was there. So that was all brilliant things to learn. But I could see that local radio was where the money was going, whereas the regional service was being dismantled. So I applied for a job on BBC Radio Humberside and got to be the founding sports editor on BBC Radio Humberside in Hull.
Fantastic. Was it? Fantastic. You're laughing.
Well, Hull is the only place, I think, that I've been where I would wake up in the morning and think, where am I? Hull. And I was with my first wife then, and she didn't like Hull very much. If you're working at a radio station there, it's great. I had a fantastic time in local radio. I was there 2.5 years. I learned more in that 2.5 years about broadcasting and the media than I've ever learned anywhere else, because you do everything. I did the news, I presented, I was a disc jockey, I was the sports editor, so I would present the long sports programme, 3-4 hour sports programme. And then when the local elections came up, the news editor said to me, would you like to present the local elections programme? Because you're the person who knows how to present a long programme.
3 hours is a long time.
And that was more or less the same thing for the local election results. So it was absolutely terrific, local radio. And the only problem, I suppose, is you're always wondering who listens to this. The audiences are not huge. So I was looking to move on by the time I'd been there a couple of years or maybe 18 months.
Well, I saw several clips of you interviewing Margaret Thatcher. I think that was ATV
Correct.
Today. You were a very frequent interviewer of her. How did that happen?
I happened to arrive at ATV when there were 2 or 3 big industrial stories. So there was a Chrysler, the American car company. Chrysler had factories in the Midlands at that time. There was the Triumph motorcycle works at Meriden, which was closing down. The British motorcycle industry was on the verge of collapse. There would be a strike every month at British Leyland. So there was an awful lot of industrial news. And I found myself doing a lot of the industrial stories. I think a lot of reporters like murders and so on, and industrial news, maybe not so much. Whereas I quite liked that because it was almost like doing history in the sense that there was usually a long-running story that you needed to be able to understand to talk about the latest development. I was made the industrial correspondent and did a lot of industrial stuff. And then in February 1974, there was a general election. And the political editor said, tough for me at this time of year, I've got all these programmes to present and so on. Would you actually take on some of the programmes? So I started doing these discussion programmes with MPs.
Oh, my goodness.
As well as being the industrial correspondent, I tended to be the person who was sent to interview the senior politician if the political editor wasn't around. And so I interviewed Thatcher, I think, 4 times.
How did you find her?
Well, it's quite interesting. At that time, she was quite lacking in confidence. Do you remember she was famously told to lower her voice by an octave? She was given a piece of advice by a media advisor, lower your voice by an octave because you sound too strident. And I think that hadn't happened at the time when I interviewed her. But I remember they had the Royal Show, which is a big agricultural, in inverted commas, show. All sorts of stuff goes on. Big, big event. And ATV Today used to be presented from there for a week while it was on. I was there. there was a kind of reception committee. It's a bit like when the king is introduced to the teams at the FA Cup final, you know. And
Yes.
so there was a row of dignitaries for Margaret Thatcher to be introduced to. And I was at the end of the line. And the editor of ATV Today was taking her along the line. And as he got to me, he said, "Oh, and this is the young man who'll be interviewing you." And she said, "I'm not doing an interview. I don't want to do an interview." And so then I had to try to, well, you just actually 3 million viewers. And of course, I know you're keen to increase Conservative support in the West Midlands. I know it's one of your target areas. Anyway, so eventually she said she would do an interview, but she would only answer questions about agriculture.
Which presumably isn't what you wanted to ask her.
No. And I think we started with a question about agriculture and then just moved it on to other things. She was not at all the confident figure with the media that she became later on. They interviewed Heath and Wilson, Michael Foot, Heseltine.
Oh my goodness. Who are you most impressed by of that group of politicians?
That's a very good question. Michael Heseltine, though I admire him in many ways, politically, wasn't great, I remember. I remember asking him about, there was a Labour government plan for how to rescue British Leyland. And he said, "Oh, well, we'll be working it all out if we're in government or something." I interviewed Ted Heath after he'd ceased being Prime Minister. What was interesting about Heath was his blatant enthusiasm for Europe. And there was no attempt to disguise this. I know Heath is often seen as quite a cold fish, I suppose, isn't he? But I felt there was a genuine passion in him. Wilson was very polished. I made a documentary about what was then the National Exhibition Centre. And we managed to persuade Harold Wilson to be interviewed for this regional television documentary. And I remember I was doing the interview with him at Chequers, and Wilson said, "I won't try and imitate the voice." And he said, "And of course, your Chamber of Commerce, or I think the Chamber of Industry, you call it now." I thought this is very impressive that either he or somebody has done the homework on this one. Shirley Williams was very charming, I remember, and very patient and amenable. It's an awful thing to say, isn't it? I don't feel any of them completely kind of knocked my socks off.
You moved into doing documentaries because I think you've done 40,
over
40,
I think it's
haven't
something
you?
like that.
And of course, the one that I saw, which when we're heading back to New College again, was a day return to Oxford.
Correct, yes.
And I watched it and I so enjoyed it. And it definitely reminded me of the first line of L.P. Hartley's book, The Go-Between, which is the past is a foreign country. They did things differently there. And I think in the 8 years between you leaving Oxford and then doing the documentary, gowns were no longer obligatory in tutorials and lectures. There were more women. When I was there, it was different. And now I have friends' children who are there and it's radically different now. They certainly work a lot harder than I did. Not all institutions have managed change effectively. What has Oxford done that's made it continue to be as successful as it is?
That's a very good question. When I went back, as you say, it's only 8 years different. It doesn't feel like a lot, but it did feel very different for some of the reasons that you've mentioned. When I was put down for New College, to apply for New College, I thought I'd hit the jackpot because if I remember rightly, New College announced that it was going to admit women.
Yes,
and I thought, this is fantastic. I've hit the jackpot. And then New College was persuaded by the rest of the university at that point not to admit women. One of the first things noticeable was that there were women in what had been the men's colleges, because there were the women's colleges, obviously, when I was there, but they all were pretty much out on the periphery. As to why Oxford has been able to change, well, I suppose one factor must be that some pretty clever people in charge.
Yes. What was the appeal of documentary making?
Well, I was fortunate enough to make 2 documentaries when I was at ATV, so still in my 20s. So I made the one about Oxford and the one about the National Exhibition Centre. And again, I think it's maybe that thing of a bit like being the industrial correspondent. News is great to work in and it's very exciting, but certainly in my day, it was very much the windscreen wiper comes across at the end of the day and you wipe that away and the next day you do something different. I think the first hour-long documentary I did was for Thames Television, which was a very interesting project because that was a program called Shutdown, and it was about the closure of a shipyard in the northeast of England in the 1980s. If you go back to about the early first decade of the 20th century, 15% of all the world's ships were built on the River Tees. Staggering thought.
15% of the world?
Of all the world's ships were built on the River Tees.
Wow.
By the time we got to the 1980s, there was only one shipyard left on the River Tees in a place called Southbank near Middlesbrough, and that was closing. So the point of the documentary was to find out what happened to the people working there after the shipyard closed. And we got Teesside Polytechnic in those days, now the University of Teesside, got them to do a piece of research with a representative sample of the workforce. So we had more than anecdote. We had actual statistical evidence. X% was still unemployed, X% went on a training course of some kind, X% left the area, got on their bike and so on. And that was a really interesting documentary to work on. Thatcher actually went to Teesside as part of her launch of the regenerating the inner cities. So it was quite a nice laboratory to, does Thatcherism work in this context? And I was able to make a second documentary 2 years later. And the sad thing was that then Thames lost its franchise and that project died away, which I was really sad about that because I felt this was something that you could do for 15, 20 years and it would still be pertinent because it would be about whether you can regenerate an area, whether the strategies that were being used worked.
Did you feel that the strategies...
Certainly in the time that I was covering, there also was a peculiarity about the benefit system in those days that you got help towards your mortgage, but there was a waiting period. I forget what it was, 2 months, 3 months. So if you're on an employment benefit, I think you got help towards your mortgage. But if you took a temporary job, you lost that. But then if the temporary job ended, there was 2 or 3 months waiting time before it came. And so it was actually working as a disincentive to taking on temporary jobs. I think the feeling was that it wasn't really working. I did have a couple of goes at resurrecting it, but the trouble was that Thames Television owned all the research, they owned all the footage, and so I was working on other things and it never really happened.
Is there a documentary that you look back and think, oh, I'm particularly proud of that piece of work?
I think the most interesting person that I interviewed for a documentary was Salman Rushdie. It's a program for Reuters television called Newsmaker, which they sold all over the world. The premise is very simple. You find somebody in the news and you do an interview with them, but you don't run it as an interview. You break it up with footage and a bit of narration. And the in the news bit was fairly loose, so you didn't need a particular news peg that week. But I got to interview Salman Rushdie when he was under the fatwa, and he was just utterly spellbinding to listen to. I was lucky enough to get, I think, 45 minutes with him. The detective had to sweep the room and all of this. This is one of the great privileges of working in television, that I've got Salman Rushdie sitting there and I can ask him pretty well any damn fool question I feel like for 45 minutes. He's the only major novelist, I think that's true, the only major novelist I've ever interviewed. So maybe it's just that he was a great storyteller, but he certainly was. I think that's still the most electrifying interview that I've ever had the privilege of conducting.
Let's move on to your books, because you have written 11 books.
Yes.
You are one of Britain's leading disaster historians. You've written 6 books on the history of disasters: Disaster of London, Britain, the World, the Military, Natural and Otherwise. In fact, actually 8 books in there, because you've also written one on floods and storms.
That's so right, I think... Yeah. It depends a bit on how you count them. The first book I wrote was a book called Shutdown, which was tied up with the documentary I talked about. So that was the book of the documentary. But the first book that I did that wasn't a television tie-in was... It appeared under the title A Disastrous History of London, and then it got updated and extended and it became London's Disasters, or London Disasters, I think. And it all happened completely by accident.
So how did it happen?
Right. Well, the funny thing is, when I was a boy, I wanted to be an author. But it was only when I got into my 50s that I could afford to be an author.
So you never lost that desire?
I never did, actually. And I was always feeling I'd love to write a book. And so it was great to be able to write the book with Shutdown, because even though it's a tie-in with the television documentary, obviously there's a lot more material in the book. But then I was looking for, as a freelance producer director, you're always trying to get things off the ground, trying to get projects off the ground. And series producer, I came up with this idea in 2003 was going to be the 50th anniversary of the Canvey Island flood of 1953, the Coronation Year flood, which devastated the East Coast. About 50 people drowned on Canvey Island. So I thought, well, this is a great peg for a series on London disasters. So I devised this 6-part series about the history of London's disasters. And I knew a guy quite well who was London Weekend, knew people at Thames, and I offered this series, and they all kind of said, yeah, really interesting, but not for us, not at this moment. BBC were not really doing regional documentaries at that time. So I thought, I've done all this work. Maybe there's a book in this. So I was very fortunate because I sent it off to, I think, 2 or 3 people. And what is now the History Press came back to me quite quickly and said, oh, this sounds good. Yeah, why not? And so I wrote Disastrous History of London for the History Press. And that was my first foray into writing a book, as it were, from scratch. Fascinating to do. I was also doing communications training. I do communications coaching still, managed to do that astonishingly. And that provided me with a reasonable income. Whenever I had a spare moment, I would work on the book.
And so as soon as you finished that one, on the popularity of it, they then said, okay, well, let's extend it. Let's do Britain. Let's do the world.
Yes. Well, I always thought the trick was to try and get your next proposal in before they've seen the sales figures for the previous one. So as soon as I'd presented the manuscript, I thought, London disasters, yeah. Are there any books on British disasters? Is there a history of British disasters? Astonishingly, there did not appear to be. And so I thought, that's the next one. I offered them A Disastrous History of Britain, and that became the second book I did for them. Then World Disasters. But the interesting thing was, I was very lucky selling London's disasters, and I didn't realise actually how difficult it can sometimes be. As an independent producer in radio and in television, I'd learned how difficult it can be to sell ideas. When I got to World Disasters, the history press didn't want it, and I think I got 42 rejections. I think is the same number that Frederick Forsyth got for The Day of the Jackal. But unfortunately, that is where the similarity to Day of the Jackal ends. Anyway, so eventually I found a publisher who would take it on, the publisher I'd never written for before. I could see it as a boxed set.
Yes, so transition from one to the next.
The fact that they're for different publishers slightly messes it up, I think. But anyway, I think they're all still in print, astonishingly.
No, they are. A couple of stories that you found out that particularly stayed with you.
One of the things that you do see is that you see the human spirit at its best and its worst in disasters, and you come across astonishing acts of heroism. Other things I've done is I've sometimes trained people on crisis communications. And so one of the things that struck me is that major disasters are rarely caused by one thing. So if you take the King's Cross fire, for example, 1987, there's a whole panoply of things that went badly wrong. And if just one of those hadn't gone badly wrong, maybe it wouldn't have happened. And so one of the things I always used to say to people is that in organisations all over the world, not everything is done by the book every day. And that's fine until something goes wrong, because then everything that wasn't done by the book becomes an issue. And that was one of the things, that the multiple things that go wrong usually in a major accident.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because actually a dear friend of mine, Roger Kendall, was the main fire chief at King's Cross. Oh, actually he wasn't, but then his superior was injured and then he suddenly thrown into dealing with it. So what were the things that went wrong in that situation?
Well, one was that the fact that there was a wooden escalator which was due to be replaced. There were years of accumulated dust, debris, grease underneath the escalator. Smoking had been banned not very long before, but a blind eye tended to be turned to people lighting up on the escalator when they were going out of the station. I don't think it's ever been completely established. The surmise is somebody was lighting up, dropped a lighted match, which went through onto the debris underneath the escalator and caught fire. So that was a major failing, that they'd not cleaned the escalators. The smoking ban was not being enforced properly. You mentioned the fire brigade. The fire brigade, as I understand it, had no proper plan of King's Cross, which was the most complex station on the network. I think it's about 6 different levels, King's Cross, something like that. When they got to King's Cross, there was building work going on, and there should have been a plan available, but it was behind a builder's hoarding. People in the ticket office didn't really know there was a fire, and tickets were being sold to people to go onto the underground after the fire had broken out. And there was just a complete absence of communication. I think the station master had been put in a temporary office that was miles from anywhere. Anything that you could imagine went wrong pretty well did. And I think the police and the fire brigade's communication system couldn't speak to each other. I think that was another of the factors. Of course, these things are very sobering to read about. What else do I remember? Just odd disasters. There was a very bad disaster on the pond at Regent's Park. Victorians love skating. When the boating lake at Regent's Park froze over, great, we'll get on the ice. And unfortunately, a lot of people went on the ice and the ice started to crack and people were wearing big, heavy coats. A lot of Victorians couldn't swim. And so a lot of people drowned. You probably remember the Marchioness disaster on the Thames.
Yes, and that was my same friend was there for that as well.
And there was the Princess Alice disaster in the 19th century, which was eerily similar. It was a pleasure boat that was run down by a big, heavy barge, further downriver, if I remember rightly.
One of the things that I think is so brilliant about your books, I so enjoy them, John, but is you manage to distill all these facts and make it such an enjoyable read. I don't know how you've managed to get that volume of research and knowledge and manage to distill it to something that someone like me is going to think, wow, turning the pages, thinking, well, what's going to happen next?
Well, this is good to hear.
Well, one of them was flu pandemic of 1918. 19,000 Britons died the week post the signing of the armistice.
Yes.
And so the first week of peace.
Yes. And of course, because of COVID, there's a lot more interest in that. I don't think I was that aware of the Great Flu epidemic till I wrote the book. I might have been vaguely aware of it. No idea of its scale. Astonished when I read about its scale. And one of the odd things about it was that it tended to kill people, I think particularly men in the prime of life, whereas flu tends to be worse for old people and occasionally for very young children. So it was an anomaly in that way. Was that to do with the privations of the First World War? Was that to do with the fact that young men had spent years in unsanitary, unhealthy conditions, maybe got wounded? I don't think anybody's got the answer to that, but it's certainly something you're impelled to speculate about.
That's so tragic that they go and survive that, and then they're felled by the flu epidemic. Assassin's deeds, I'd love to talk just a little bit about. The first assassinations go back thousands of years. Having compiled such a comprehensive and detailed account of all these events, has any assassination had a more devastating impact than that carried out by Gavrilo Princip of Archduke Franz Ferdinand?
Yes. You mentioned that assassination goes back thousands of years. When one of the things that I found, I have a certain prejudice in trying to tell a story from the beginning to the end. And in a lot of books, I try to start at the beginning. Because actually, I often find that the early stuff is the stuff people don't know.
I knew nothing of the early chapters.
Because Franz Ferdinand and JFK, most people will have heard of them. There is a good deal of dispute as to what degree Princip's assassination of the Archduke caused the First World War. Something like 39 days between the assassination and the outbreak of the First World War. So what some people would say is, well, yeah, okay, it was obviously going to lead to tensions, that a number of bad decisions were taken during that time, and that actually the First World War could have been headed off. But interestingly, one of the assassins didn't have much doubt, because he said, if I'd known this was all going to lead to, I'd have sat on my bomb and blown myself up. In a way, it's a love story, because the Archduke Franz Ferdinand had married, as the emperor saw it, below himself, and he'd married a countess called Sophie Chotek, and the imperial family had tried to bully him into not marrying her, and so there was all sorts of restrictions that their children couldn't inherit the throne. She wasn't able to sit next to him at official functions. She wasn't Her Royal Highness. But there was a loophole, which was that when he was acting in his capacity as Field Marshal of the Austro-Hungarian army, he could take her with him and she would have the full honours of a Field Marshal's wife. And so that was why he took her to Sarajevo that day, their wedding anniversary. And of course, the first go that the assassins had was a complete fiasco. I think there were 6 assassins around the route, armed with grenades and pistols. One of them managed to throw a grenade, which bounced off the Archduke's car, exploded and injured people in another car in the motorcade. But apart from that, nobody else got a shot off, and most of them had gone home. Princip went to a coffee shop, was bemoaning the failure of their enterprise, and then the Archduke insisted on going to visit the injured who were in hospital. And so went off again. There was a mix-up because the organiser had been injured. The Archduke's driver didn't know the route, and the car came to a stop outside the coffee shop where Princip was refreshing himself. And he came out, couldn't believe his luck, shot the Archduke and shot Sophie. I think one of the things that came out to me was assassination's quite difficult. An awful lot of things can go wrong, and most assassination attempts fail. The chances are that ought to have failed, this assassination attempt. This extraordinary chapter of accidents was what led it to succeed. There was a famous BBC drama called, I think, 39 Days, which is about the period between the assassination and the outbreak of the First World War. And I think, again, the thesis of that probably is that there were just slightly different decisions taken by European leaders might have led to a different outcome. But yeah, it was a pretty cataclysmic event.
In your book, I read Mahatma Gandhi denounced assassination, describing it as a Western institution that had never done any good. He himself was assassinated. Was there ever an assassination, in your view, where the ripple effects were for the good, in which case the end justified the means.
It was certainly a failed one where the ends, I think, would have justified the means. There were a number of assassination plots against Hitler, but there was a particular one that happened in the early months of the war, I think about November 1939. A communist carpenter called Georg Elser, who knew that Hitler would speak at a beer keller in Munich on an anniversary of his failed putsch in 1923. And he knew that whatever happened, Hitler would not duck this date because the Allied bombing raids were happening. And so it's astonishing to read this, but he, over a period of time, carved a hole in a strut that was holding up a balcony above where Hitler would be speaking. Excavate a hole in this pillar and put a time bomb in it and then close up the hole. Sets the time bomb for the time when he knows Hitler will be speaking. And it all works perfectly. The time bomb goes off at precisely the right moment. The ceiling is brought down over the speaker's platform. About 8 people killed, I think, but not Hitler. Because of Allied bombing raids, he'd actually started his speech, I think it was something like 11 minutes early and finished 11 minutes early. And so he escaped. Of course, then there's von Stauffenberg's plot much later. But of course, Hitler had done most of his damage by then, whereas in the early months of the war, if Hitler had been assassinated then, one of the things you always think is, yes, but okay, well, if Hitler had gone, there would have been somebody else would have taken over. But whether anybody with Hitler's fanaticism, his dark gifts would have taken over is questionable. And that's certainly an event. If that had come off, I would have thought the end would have justified the means there.
Yes. Going through your book, in those early days, there are so many assassinations intra-family, everyone jostling for the position, either the royal family or in political circles. Mothers killing sons, sons killing mothers. I would think in this day and age, people would choose their offspring over the top job. Do you think the human condition has changed?
I did a statistical analysis about 260 assassinations, and certainly in the early parts of his, so probably up to the year 1000, and maybe even beyond that, dynastic ambition tended to be the top cause, top motive. And yes, so that often meant it was murder within the family. And actually, even in the 16th century, I think there was an Ottoman sultan who had about 19 of his brothers strangled. Big families, of course, because of the harem system. Were people more ruthless in those days? I suppose one thing that is likely to be different is that our evaluation of human life is probably different now, isn't it? I mean, if you went back to those days, your life expectancy was not great. A lot of people died early in life. Reminds me of, there was a Tom Stoppard play where, I can't remember which one it was, where one of the characters is a mass murderer. And when he's reproached about the murders he's committed, he said, well, it's not as though the alternative was immortality. Maybe human life was valued less in those days because death seemed a much closer thing. I don't know.
Lee Harvey Oswald, JFK, final question. What do you think happened?
Well, what I'd done with the assassinations was that unless I'd thought there was some very good reason not to, I'd generally gone along with what was the accepted narrative. There are some odd things about it, certainly. And one thing is that a successful assassination by sniper is relatively rare. If you go back, I think I found in the book that it wasn't until about the early 19th century that the gun, the firearm, took over from the knife or some sort of stabbing object as the favourite means. And then it tended to be the handgun at close quarters rather than the sniper's rifle. There's been this series, hasn't there, about Death by Lightning, about the assassination of James Garfield.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
The second American president to be assassinated. And again, it's the handgun at close quarters. The sniper, relatively few people have been successfully assassinated by sniper. So that's the first thing. There was conflicting evidence about whether Oswald was a good shot or not. Some of his army reports say he was a really good shot. Some say he was okay. He seemed to travel between Russia and America in both directions with surprising ease. I mean, he defects from America to Russia. I don't think a lot of people did that. Then he's able to come back to America. If you were the American...
Certainly not today.
I was going to say, if President Trump was in charge, I'm not sure you would have been able to do it quite as easily. But he was able to come back. And then there was an oddness about the way he was arrested. He shot dead a police officer. And then he was run down in a movie theatre. But he didn't seem to be as determined to escape as you might have expected. And there's this famous remark about, I'm just a patsy. I think it's something like 1,000 books have been written about the assassination. I don't think I have anything more to add to what they've said. But it was interesting. I think when President Trump was last in power, he was down to release many, many more documents. And some of those were pulled at the last minute. I think there has been another document release, hasn't there? And I think the consensus was it didn't tell us much more than we already know or don't know.
Okay. Well, Secrets of the Centenarians, this book broke new ground and it was serialized in the Daily Mail.
It was, yes, that's right. Well, the funny thing about Secrets of the Centenarians was that, in a way, it was an offshoot from a television program that I'd made in 1986. I was working on a series called TVI on Thames Television, went out on the ITV network. So for younger listeners, in the old days, ITV used to do serious current affairs. And TVI was one of the flagship current affairs programs. And so I'd spotted a tiny little paragraph, 4 lines in the Daily Telegraph saying that there were, I think, something like, in 1984, there were 30 times as many centenarians as there'd been 30 years before. It may have been 10 times as many, but there'd been a staggering increase in the number of centenarians. And I thought, well, that's an interesting story here. I did a bit of work on it, and it wasn't quite TVI's staple diet. People would say it was a little bit soft for what TVI normally did. But anyway, we managed to make a program about it, got the best rating for any TVI that series. I thought, well, there's a documentary in this. And I got very close to selling it to a couple of television companies, never managed to do it. And then by about 2010, I'd established quite a close relationship with this publisher. I think I'd done 4 books for him at that time. I'd got to the stage, which all authors want to get to, where I could actually go to the guy who took the decisions and kick around some ideas and say, what do you think about this? Rather than spending a month writing a treatment and then being told, no, it's not really for us. I kicked this around with him and he said, oh, yeah, I think that sounds interesting. So he bought the idea. And so I was writing it, getting on for 30 years, actually, after the television documentary. Things had moved on. The curve had got less spectacular. The increase was still going on, but the curve had got a bit less steep than it had been. But I was thrilled to get it off the ground because I was surprised that nobody else really had picked this up. They were the fastest growing portion of the population, 100-year-olds, post-100-year-olds.
Having done all this research and spoken to all of these centenarians, what habits, philosophies, cultural patterns have you learned that have allowed them to do that?
One of the things I used to keep saying to people is this is not a how-to book.
Well, I picked some things that we're going to talk about.
Not only my impressions, there's also quite a lot of academic research that I read to do with what appeared to be key factors. You're doing one thing right, Katie. You're a woman. Women survive better than men at all ages. So if you look at what they call life tables, women survive better than men at all ages. The effect is a little bit less pronounced, I think, around 40 and 50, but tended to accelerate a lot after retirement. So there was a theory. The reason was that after retirement, men sat in a chair, watched the telly, ran to fat, and women were still doing housework. And so that was one theory. I think there are quite a lot of theories that women's immune system is superior. Even baby boys have less good mortality than baby girls. So that's one thing. Sex is perhaps the most important, clear determinant, though I have to tell you that the gap is closing. Reasons advanced for that are women are becoming more like men, drinking more, smoking more, doing more stressful jobs. Ancestry is very important. So if you come from long-lived predecessors, you've got a very good chance, a better chance than the average of living to a good old age. There was a big argument about whether having a hard life or a soft life was better. There is a conclusion, which is slightly boringly that better off people survive better than less well-off people. That doesn't mean you won't get the odd extraordinary exception. I think I remember writing about a 100-year-old. She'd been born into like a family of 9 in a farmhouse that had no electricity, no running water, toiled all her life on the farm. So you'll always find exceptions. But being rich, coming from longer-lived parents, being female if you possibly can, all of those are important factors. The psychological ones, obviously more contested and have less hard evidence. But there was this idea that conscientious people live longer. So one theory based on no evidence was, it'll be the happy-go-lucky ones. It'll be the people who don't get worried about life. Whereas actually they perhaps were more likely to die in accidents or whatever. So I think there became this idea that it was people who took things seriously and were well organised, but at the same time didn't let stress get too much on top of them. Another factor, of course, is luck. There are 100-year-olds, not now sadly, but when I was writing the book, I think there were just about 100-year-olds who'd survived the First World War. All of the 100-year-olds had horrible scrapes in the First World War. The chance at any time that they would be killed is obviously very high. So luck is another very important factor. Concentration camp survivors went on to live to 100. Some of them, the odds against that are pretty phenomenal.
Yes. And I took a few things away.
Probably read it since I have.
Yeah. Well, no, people in the Hunza Valley have a better than average chance of living to 100, which I thought maybe it's just living somewhere very beautiful and rural might do something.
Do you know, I have to tell you some bad news here. I think there was this idea about the Shangri-Las. The Hunza Valley was one of them. Georgia in the Caucasus was another.
Most of them Sicily, I think, as well, and Okinawa as well was one.
Yeah, there was more basis for Okinawa. Okinawa, there was actually some evidence, and some decent evidence. I can't remember who it was said it. It might have been one of the editors of the Guinness Book of Records, one of the McWhirters, but said, in no area of human achievement are lies more pronounced than in claims of longevity. In Georgia, there were all these men who were supposed to be 150 years old and were still riding to market on their horse every day. Interestingly enough, it tended to be men, which set alarm bells going straight away, because in any other society, it's the women who live longer. Yeah. Most of the Shangri-Las have been discredited. You're right, Okinawa did have some statistical evidence. Unfortunately, on Okinawa, I think the effect has fallen off. Same thing happened in Sardinia, I think, to some degree as well. And I think, again, it was thought that, was this to do with more incomers coming, bringing bad habits, or was it the fact that Okinawans were moving elsewhere for economic opportunity? If you look at the places where there are claims of great longevity, they're often correlated with areas where birth certificates are not well kept. Only one human being is known to have lived past 120. A woman called Jeanne Calment, a French woman, is the only human being out of all the billions who've lived known to have gone past 120. And she was still reasonably active and certainly mentally completely sharp. Her birthday, as you can imagine, became quite a media event every year. And so the press would always show up. I think she was in an old people's home. The press would always show up. And one year, a young man, a reporter said to her, "Good to see you looking so well. Till next year, perhaps." And she said, "Well, yes, I don't see why not. You look reasonably healthy to me."
So she was clearly not missing anything.
When I did the programme in 1986 for television, we did a survey. We sent questionnaires to 100-year-olds. They were allowed to get proxies to fill them in. I forget what the figure was, but one of the questions we asked was, "Are you glad to have lived to 100? And actually, there was a majority who were glad to have reached 100.
Oh, well, that's really good to know. The other things I picked up was that taking afternoon tea was a good thing to do, which I'm going to do now. At the end of the book, you talked about experts are very conflicted about whether there is actually a limit on life. And some thought that in the future, not too distant future, maybe you would go into hospital for 2 months and have kind of an MOT. You'd come out a decade or two younger biologically. And others say absolutely not the case at all. What do you think?
I fall back on that opinion is divided. It's striking to me that Jeanne Calment, the only person we know to have lived past 120, died in, I think, the 1980s. Her record has stood for 40 years, and there's nobody immediately threatening that record. So maybe the answer is that as we are today, it does look as though around 120 is some kind of limit. But one of the things that's happening is a lot more research is now going on into aging. And of course, we've got all these hyper-rich tech people, haven't we?
Oh, yeah, they are, taking their children's blood.
All sorts of exotic things are being worked on. So who knows? There has been a fairly remorseless improvement in life expectancy over quite a long period of time. That came to an end. COVID, of course, has had a big effect on that, because we're talking averages here. The bounce in life expectancy was hit by COVID, but was hit before COVID. Some people think by austerity. Remorseless improvements seem to have stalled. And in some countries like Russia, it actually went into reverse. So assuming the human race survives, we do have a history of technological progress in areas that we're determined to achieve it in, on the whole. So if a lot more effort goes into research into aging, maybe at least it'll improve the quality of life.
Yes, which is actually more important.
Which is really actually more important, even if there remains some kind of cut-off point.
Yes. These amazing books that you write, when you sit down and think, okay, I've got the disasters of the world, how do you get from all of that to writing such an enjoyable, readable book?
Well, I'm glad they're enjoyable and readable. The first thing I think is having to do the treatment is really good. When I used to write essays at school for exams, you were always told, do a plan before you start writing, and I never did. So I think the discipline of having to approach a publisher, and it starts with documentaries, I suppose, and longer television programs, that you would need to present a treatment of some kind. So that's the first thing. So that means you've got to get your thoughts into some kind of order. I think also that, I suppose I learned it in television to some degree. You learn about the building blocks of a book or of a story. What are the building blocks? And you need a variety of building blocks. So even on a book like Assassination, hopefully there are one or two lighter moments in it. It's not relentless. What I tend to do, I suppose, is that I would try to read some fairly general books at the start and look at fairly general articles, say about 100-year-olds. So to try and get some kind of overall picture, and then to try to home in on what seem the most interesting bits of that general picture. Insofar as I've got a formula, I think that's it. Yeah. The great thing about television and books, really, is that you learn all sorts of things when you start writing. I never knew the love story element of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
Neither did I, till I read.
Suddenly popped up, and
yes.
I thought, isn't that amazing?
It is, and it's actually those stories that are the ones that capture you the most, really. 3 quick questions to wrap up, if that's okay. Biggest disaster in your life, since you're a historian about disasters?
Wow, biggest in my life. If you asked me in history, it'd be easy to answer. Biggest in my life? Well, no, the one that had most emotional effect on me, because I'm a lifelong Manchester United supporter. And so it was the Munich air crash of 1958, when Manchester United plane coming back from Belgrade crashed at Munich. I would have been 10 at the time. I remember that vividly. 8 players died, and I think 3 never played again, and another 2 or 3 were never the same again. Team was wiped out, really. So that certainly is the one that had most emotional effect on me.
And how would you define a life well lived?
Ooh, one that you've enjoyed, I suppose. When you get to my age, you go to a lot of funerals. I was at a funeral not long ago, and I was talking to a young relative, and he was saying, I'd love to try being a chef, but I could make more money by doing X, Y, Z. I forget what it was. And I said to him, well, if you can spend your life doing something you want to do, that is worth an awful lot of money. So I think, yes, I'm afraid it's all the boring things like make the most of life. We're only here the once. It isn't a rehearsal. Try to think positively about life.
And final one, advice you could give to creatives, so thinkers, seekers of today?
It was a lot easier in my day. I was born in the 1940s. I'm not sure that I know enough about the media landscape these days. I'm not sure I have much advice to give about how you get there. But once you've got there, I think just remember it is the most fantastic privilege. I mentioned the privilege of being able to interview people like Salman Rushdie. As a writer, you write to be read. That's why most writers don't make a lot of money out of writing books. You write to be read. And if people read what you've written, that is an enormous privilege. So make the most of it. If you possibly can, try to follow your ideas, try to do the things that you want to do. Not always easy.
John, it's been an enormous privilege for me to interview you today. And thank you so, so much for being here. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to all at the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.